Welcome to another edition of Fronteras, a Changing America. Last edition that all of you had the opportunity to join in on a political roundtable, we ended up having a discussion about the debt ceiling, about the lack of leadership that is being shown in Washington, D.C., about the frustrations that we all have as citizens, not only of our great nation, but of our community, in terms of the leadership being exhibited. The political roundtable discussion continues on today's show. We're going to be having an interesting discussion about precisely the same issues, the debt ceiling, where we're headed, and the kind of lack of leadership that our community is currently exhibiting precisely when we're trying to get rid of the FBI scandals. Another one hits in our community with the El Paso Independent School District superintendent being arrested, and well, a lot of suspicions and questions about what he has been up to lately. Joining us on the discussion and political roundtable today, we have an interesting panel that not only is comprised of an in-studio guest, but also one guest joining us all the way from Washington, D.C. Joining us today, we have Gabriel Nila, back from our last political roundtable discussion. Of course, he is the host of The Common Man on ElPasoForAmerica.com. And joining us all the way from Washington, D.C., we have the press secretary to U.S. Congressman Reyes, Vincent Perez, joining us all the way from D.C. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Well, the discussion is one of frustration. There is a lot of frustration in America right now about what is ongoing in terms of the debt ceiling, the fact that it took so long for it to get resolved. In fact, our last show where we had our political roundtable, we were talking 2 weeks ago, and the frustrations were already pretty high as they were. And Gabriel, you were there in that discussion. It took 2 weeks later, after the show we had last time around, here we are talking about the same discussion again. Your ideas and thoughts about that frustration. You still as frustrated? How do you feel?
Actually, I am. I'm still frustrated with the fact that it just took this long to complete. Yeah. Now I understand the premise of the whole political wrangling, and what everybody wanted to make sure that they got the best bang for the buck. Right. But it was just it just took so long, and many people are still not happy with the end results.
And you know, I'm very curious about those end results. We have Vincent Perez, press secretary to Congressman Reyes, and Vince, you and I have been, friends for quite some time. This is the kind of stuff we would talk about back during our college days, about frustration when it came to government, the frustration when it came to the way things were done. Tell us a little bit about the process, how things went, maybe some of the frustrations that U.S. Congressman Reyes had as well.
Right, it has been a very frustrating process. Part of the problem is that we have these new 87 Tea Party freshmen that have come in and have really, refused to compromise on a variety of issues. This is really the third time it is that we've seen sort of this impasse happen. Of course, we had the first one back in December when we were discussing the extension of the Bush tax cuts. There was also sort of this impasse that they refused to compromise, whereas many Democrats, including Congressman Reyes, said that we shouldn't extend these Bush tax cuts in a time of the debts it is that we're facing. The president negotiated with them, and the tax cuts were extended for an additional 2 years. Now, then we saw this just a couple months ago with the government shutdown. Yeah. Again, we were on the verge of a government shutdown, again, because there was a refusal to compromise on government spending. And so this is really the third impasse that we've seen, and it has been a very frustrating process.
I mean, and here's the frustrating point. Everybody talking about jobs, everybody talking about when are we going to get to jobs. You flip to any major leader, whether it's Harry Reid or the other part, it doesn't matter who is talking. Everybody's talking about how now they can focus on jobs. But a lot of people talking about the fact that jobs really won't be able to be focused on because this new deal somehow handcuffs some of the things that traditionally the government can do to stimulate job development. What's the situation with that?
Well, and certainly, and I think you saw that uncertainty in the markets yesterday. I mean, the stock market was down 200 points. I think it was down to 2.1%. Because, yeah, sure, we got this debt deal done, but now it's like, let's look at the job scenario. It doesn't look very positive. Typically in recessions, you try to stimulate spending, and that's what President Obama tried to do when he first came into office with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Now, part of the problem with that legislation was it just wasn't big enough. There are those who like to criticize the president for saying, oh, you added $1 trillion to the debt. but half of that was made up of the tax cuts that Republicans wanted. So we had very little stimulus spending for job growth. Now with these cuts that were made, that were agreed to when we had the government shutdown negotiations, and now the $1.2 trillion in cuts that take effect over 10 years, and the additional $1.5 trillion cuts that will be negotiated in November. I mean, yeah, that's exactly what Democrats are saying, is that where's the job growth? Where are the jobs that Republicans promised that they would focus on when they took over the House? They have not proposed any job legislation to stimulate that job growth, and that's going to be a serious concern as we move forward.
But isn't it the case that there's neither one of either sides of Congress have brought up anything in regards to stimulate job growth?
Well, when Democrats controlled the House the previous 2 years, remember we had lots of initiatives. Remember we had cash for clunkers, all of those things to kind of stimulate purchasing, to stimulate growth. But now that the Republicans have taken over, they've taken sort of this cuts-only approach, because now their whole message is we need to cut the deficits to bring back certainty in the market so we can have job growth. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense that cutting all these trillions that we are going to stimulate job growth, particularly during this time when Americans are having a hard enough time already finding jobs.
And for me, this is the way I would see the whole situation, is that if we're spending money left and right and borrowing money from different places and we're not getting anything out of it, we're not getting any bang for our buck, whether it's in the form of rebates or any type of credits or saving jobs, if you will. Isn't it time where we just say, hey, let's just go ahead and let's go ahead and not spend so much so that we can go ahead and reserve whatever extra we have, so that we can say, okay, let's use that money and then grow once we have enough capital to go ahead and grow. It'd be similar to a business, where if you're spending too much, you want to go ahead and if you're going over the limit, you have to cut back on certain things, whether it's in the form of employment, unfortunately, or even in the form of goods that you need to go ahead and operate successfully. And then once you're able to go ahead and build a little bit on that stuff, on your reserves, then you can say, okay, let's go ahead and expand.
I mean, well, certainly, but even businesses have lines of credit to expand, during difficult times. I mean, when Americans are undergoing difficult times, they are often given lines of credit. The use of credit and the use of debt, from a government perspective, I mean, you have to use it in a very wise way. Our deficits over the long-term debts, could they be dangerous to the economy? Absolutely. But in times like this, when we see that we have weakened job growth, governments have to do something to get us out of this. Because if we do, let's say, for example, what you're saying, if we just focus on reducing the debt and then using the reserves, to stimulate job growth, well, it's actually going to cost us more money if we don't stimulate growth, because then we're going to have low or decreasing tax revenues over the long term if we can't stimulate the job growth. So if right now, if we're promoting policies that are going to keep this economy pretty stagnant or declining, as we have seen, because now we're 3 years into this Great Recession, that's going to be bad for our fiscal policy. Paul Krugman is one of those who has been saying we shouldn't even be talking about deficit reductions. We should be talking about how it is we're going to stimulate the economy, because that's the best way to promote fiscal growth, and that will ultimately lead to debt reductions down the road. But if we just focus on cuts right now, and the economy stays the way it is, it's going to actually, I think, result in a worse fiscal picture.
But what are the realities of this New Deal? A lot of people are still trying to figure out what the realities of the New Deal are. People talking about this, little super commission that's going to be developed. The fact that people still don't know how things will be resolved. Will the hands of Congress and the president, for that matter, be tied in terms of stimulating job growth in America and in places like El Paso or Las Cruces, our local communities? A lot of people talking about the fact that with this New Deal, we won't really even be able to do the things that government is traditionally used to doing in terms of stimulating job growth. Are those, true or false allegations from your perspective as a press secretary up in Congress?
No, that's certainly a huge concern. I mean, certainly when you're putting these caps, part of the other problem is that these cuts, this $1.2 trillion in cuts right now, really aren't defined yet.
Yeah.
It's sort of this sort of vague $1.2 trillion in discretionary cuts.
Weren't they supposed to be part of as the reduction in the troop levels when it comes to Iraq and Afghanistan? They were going to be counting that part of it?
That wasn't part of the agreement with the Senate side, but those savings have been factored into some calculations. But the $1.2 trillion in savings is coming from discretionary accounts, which is exactly where it is, it's sort of the program, the funding it is that's available for government to do these types of initiatives. The biggest problem, and something I didn't address earlier, the biggest problem with the package that was proposed and the package that passed the Congress and the president signed into law was that it didn't include any tax revenues. Now, I understand the need to reduce the deficits, but Congressman Reyes actually he voted against this agreement that was passed and signed into law. Was that here in this era where we have high deficits, the wealthiest 2% of Americans are still collecting from these Bush tax cuts, and I would actually argue that the wealthiest 2% and the wealthiest top 5% have disproportionately benefited from the Bush tax cuts. Those Bush tax cuts added $1.5 trillion to our deficit. In December, when we actually passed the legislation to extend the Bush tax cuts, that just for the wealthiest 2% added $60 billion to our debt. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to really talk about any sort of meaningful debt reform or deficits reductions, we not only have to talk about cuts, but we also have to talk about increasing revenues, because we are going to need that funding to stimulate job growth. And Hector, you're right. I mean, if our hands are tied right now, I mean, how do we expect to get out of this recession it is that we're already 3 years into? We're going to start, mirroring Japan, which was in a recessionary period for 10 years.
Well, that's my concern. And is Congressman Reyes legitimately concerned about this? Is this his biggest concern at the time being? Because a lot of people talking about the fact that if the things that you're saying are now confirmed, Vince, and the fact that, yes, we will have our hands tied in terms of being able to develop jobs, and then how much of what is currently being said amounts to lip service from the men and women of the Senate and the men and women of Congress, especially now that they go back, just like Congressman Reyes is flying back to speak with his constituents. So what is the message? That we're going to try to work on jobs without really having any kind of plan for it? I mean, how does Congressman Reyes react to all of this? Because I'm sure this concerns him as much as it concerns us.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's why he voted against this debt deal, because, I mean, precisely for that reason. It doesn't create jobs, and it really isn't a balanced approach. It's asking seniors, about $15 billion or so was cut from Medicare providers. That's going to be very critical for the border region, because lots of seniors depend on Medicare, and they're cutting the reimbursement rates that's given to doctors. Well, it's already pretty low, and we hear it from doctors all the time in El Paso and Las Cruces, from doctors who are saying is that we're not getting paid enough for the services here because the Medicare reimbursement rates are just so low. It's going to get to a point where it's not even profitable for doctors to take in Medicare patients. That's going to hurt seniors. And so, yes, it's going to have a lot of consequences. There really is no good explanation for this. I think it's going to be very difficult for Congressman Reyes to go back and for any of us to say it is that they're really focused on job creation. Congressman Reyes has said that needs to be a focus, but it's just not been from the Republican caucus. Unfortunately, they control the House and they control the agenda, and they have yet to put forth any sort of meaningful jobs bill. And they keep fitting this message that this deficit reduction plans that they're pursuing is going to create jobs. So we're cutting our way to prosperity, essentially.
Here's the part that I'm a little bit concerned about, and Vince, we can get to the job growth in just a bit. The part that scares me about the debt deal, if you will, I agree to a lot of the points as we talked in the last show. We need to increase the ceiling a little bit to make sure that we can take care of what we have to take care of, but at the same time make sure we're providing cuts. The part that scares me a lot is the fact that we have this super committee that's going to be making the decisions to decide whether or not or where the cuts are going to be. It's that piece, and the part for me is because of the fact that both sides are just so polarized in their beliefs, and my guess is that we're going to go back to the wire again and say, okay, this is the decision that's going to be made, and that's the part that really scares me, and the report that's coming out, and you probably heard this also, is the fact that there's a report out there saying that I believe the White House is looking at trying to identify or pick the people that are going to be in this committee. Now, whether it's true or not, I don't know.
Well, I'm sure the Republicans will try to pick theirs, and the Democrats will try to pick theirs.
Oh, definitely. And that's probably going to be the case. And I've got the perfect solution on that part, and you're going to think this is going to be kind of weird. Okay, and as we've talked, or as the president has talked about in the past, he wants to air stuff on C-SPAN. Well, let's go ahead and air the selection of who's going to be on. And you be basically pick a name out of the hat. you have someone independent, cut the names out on a piece of paper, put them in a hat, and say, okay, these 6 people on the Democrat side, these six people on the Republican side are going to be the people that are going to decide.
No, actually, the way the process is going to work is that I believe the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader each have 3 picks, and then the Speaker also has 3 picks, and then Leader Pelosi will have 3 picks.
And that's the scary part for me.
It's beyond scary, though. How many commissions have we had, though? How many commissions have we had? We've had tons of them. I mean, commissions come and go.
Was at the beginning of the year.
People propose cuts, and then nobody abides by the commission's.
This is different. I mean, this is a congressional commission. I mean, in the time it is that I've been here, I haven't seen that. I know the president had, one commission that also looked into deficit reduction. But what's different about this commission is that it actually is going to have the power to decide what cuts are in and what cuts are out. Now, everything's on the table with this commission. Everything now, including even tax revenues. But it also on the table is cuts to Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. And essentially, these 12 committee members will then decide what cuts are in and how it is we're going to reduce the deficit by $1.5 trillion. And then their proposals are going to come to the Congress in the House and the Senate for an up or down vote, and it cannot be amended. So it has to be passed as the committee approves.
So what is that? So is that Washington speak, Vince, for potential deadlock, and we're going to go on the triggers that are already set in the current deal? Because a lot of folks are also talking about that. The fact that if they couldn't agree on this, which was so important, perhaps they deadlock themselves on this kind of talk, especially since they can't amend from the Senate, from Congress, and we have more deadlock, and basically the triggers come in play. And then once those triggers come in play, yes, we will get some cuts, but then the question after that is, are they enough? I mean, it seems like there is a lot of, I don't know, concern or ambiguity. I'm not sure what to think. I mean, I myself, this just happened, within the last few hours, and we're getting more information as it comes, but it seems like it wasn't really as much of a victory as it's being claimed to be by both sides. I'm not sure how you both feel about that.
I'd say it's a win-loss, and you can probably correct me on that part.
A win-loss for both sides? For
both sides, and Vince may be able to correct me on that part.
We divided the Tea Party.
Yeah.
Vince?
I have the view that it was a victory for Republicans. I think the president, again, just for the mere fact that this package, this first round of cuts didn't have any additional revenues, that was a major concession. I mean, the fact that Democrats controlled 2/3 of government, the White House and the Senate, and the fact that Republicans were successful in not getting any additional tax revenue, I think that was a big victory for Republicans. And again, that's why Congressman Reyes had voted against this legislation. I mean, it's very disappointing to see that because, again, it's not a balanced approach that, it's asking certain seniors and it'll eventually have cuts that'll affect Medicaid and the poor, but we're not asking any sort of sacrifice from the wealthiest Americans, the wealthiest 2% that have benefited from those Bush tax cuts.
Would Congressman Reyes have been favorable to say it continuing to be deadlocked and for President Obama to somehow invoke the 14th Amendment? Or, I mean, what would have been the ideal scenario for Congressman Reyes from his perspective, especially the way, based on the way he voted? He obviously had some very, big differences with what was going on. What would be his ideal scenario? Well,
and certainly that was an option. One of the other reasons, too, that he voted for it is that the deadline was midnight yesterday. We had passed this legislation in the House before on August 1st. The president, and actually the vice president came in and briefed the members of Congress before they took the vote on August 1st. And Vice President Biden told the caucus that President Obama was fully prepared to exercise the 14th Amendment if need be. Mm-hmm. If that were the scenario and if Congress couldn't get it done, then I think that would have been an ideal situation where the president just, raised the debt. Again, and it's important, as the president framed this, we're not adding additional debt. This isn't giving us authorization to keep spending more and more and more. This is merely to pay the bills that have already been incurred. And so to me, it's just frustrating it is that the debt limit has been raised, I don't know how many, 40, 50 times since the 1960s, under previous administrations, both Republican and Democratic. But again, I think the Tea Party had a very effective strategy in focusing everything against President Obama in particular. They're trying to oust him for the 2012 elections, and I think they're really cornering him at every possibility.
Your thoughts on
whether it was a nice segue where I think we can talk about how what can be done from here in regards to job growth. Now that we have this in place, we acknowledge the fact that the members of the Tea Party and the Republican Party had made their strides and stood firm in getting what they wanted out of this bill. Now, I'm not going to agree with Boehner when he says that it's 98% of what we wanted. It's actually probably less of what they really wanted. But now that we have this in place, okay, we've got this here now. What are we going to do now to go ahead and move on and try to build from this piece? And this is probably going to be the part where we have to deal with either the super committee and looking at the revenue or the increase of revenue and where it's going to be at.
But here's my thing, Gabriel, and Vince over in Washington. For me, I'm not sure if we can trust the government for what's next. I mean, here's why. I mean, Vince, what was the logic? And I'm sure there's a lot of talk about it, but it just boggles my mind that we left, or not we, the representatives that we elected to both the Senate and the House left without any resolution to the whole FAA situation.
Absolutely, it's
completely frustrating for the amount of talk that they have about developing jobs.
We have something that we can maintain.
I mean, but here's the thing: over 70,000 jobs are now in jeopardy,
right?
Because there is now a partial shutdown of the FAA, and these are people that have no fault whatsoever in what's going on, and they're being used as this political pawn. Hey, but Congress is okay with going home without really dealing with this. I mean,
and here's what they probably should have had, or probably some people should have done, and whether there is people doing it right now, Vince can probably clarify in this piece. There should have been some people out there saying, "Hey, I'm here still, waiting to doing some work here, trying to get whatever information we can or get whatever deal we can, while everybody else is taking time off." As I've discussed before on several occasions on the program that I do.
Yeah.
We still have to have the machine running, and the machine and whether it's the representatives, or whether it's the people that work for the representatives, or if it's the representatives themselves saying, "Hey, I'm still here. Yeah, we've got other people taking time off, but I'm here, and we're trying to get this this ball rolling so we can get everything in place."
Vince?
I mean, yes. I mean, it sounds good in principle to stay here and say, I'm going to stay here until this is done. But ultimately, again, the Republicans control the agenda, and if there's nothing on the agenda, there's really nothing for you to do here. We also have an obligation to go and hear from our constituents and to meet with our constituents. And that's why the August recess is an important part. It's an important period to do that. We have lots of events scheduled in El Paso as well. And so, having representatives stay here when there's no action on the floor, is difficult. I mean, would we stay here if we were in session and there was movement to get this passed? Absolutely. If they decided, we're going to take a vote on this item this week, certainly everyone would come back here. But if the Republican leadership has made the decision not to do anything, they've put us in a jam. They control the agenda and they make that choice.
Yeah. It just seems that there's so much frustration about our current leadership, what they do, what they don't do. Yes, Vince, there's some people that go back to their constituencies. There are also others that utilize the auspices of junkets or whatever it is to go take trips to Fiji and stuff like that that we've seen happen before.
Or to
in
the
Congress.
Caribbean at their home.
And it just speaks to the fact, and I'd like to get your take before we conclude our show. Some new developing information about local leadership. We were talking on our last conversation about the fact that our local leadership leaves a lot to be desired. Last 3 minutes of the show, your take on what is currently going on with EPISD, El Paso Independent School District, yet another FBI situation hanging over the city of El Paso. Your thoughts on what's going on with Superintendent Garcia? We'll begin with Gabriel.
It's embarrassing. It's absolutely embarrassing. Now I understand that we have this whole thing going on with the political corruption scandals that are going on with businesses and members of council.
Yeah.
But this is, as many people talk, this is about our children. And we have the head of the school of one of the biggest school district in El Paso now being accused of improprieties, and it's rather embarrassing. And the fact that he came out, it's upsetting, especially given the fact that he's out there saying we need more money, we need more money, yet he's taking stuff on the side, and it's like, come on, really,
Vince?
Right. It is very disappointing, and it is very sad, and it certainly reflects poorly on our community. On the flip side, the FBI has been very, very aggressive. I don't know to what extent this happens. I'm sure it has to happen probably in other localities across the country. But the FBI has been very vigilant, and which is also a good thing. When I was looking at the stories and saw that there were 19 other people that have pled guilty, I mean that it certainly is a poor reflection on our community. With that said, I mean there really hasn't been, in talking about local leadership, Hector, I don't really think there's been a lot of discussion about what it is that we can do to fix this, or what can we do to make the situation any better. There has been discussion of an ethics committee at the county level, but I think something right, but I think something is that we seriously have to look at is that it's very difficult for young people to come into politics in El Paso just because it doesn't pay at all. At the city council they make what, $29,000 a year. Our mayor makes $40,000 a year. Yeah. Our state reps make $6,000 a year. I mean, that's why it is you see a lot of retirees on the city council, a lot of independently wealthy people take public office. And I think that's why it is you have people who are more susceptible to bribery.
And unfortunately, that's what goes on with, I mean, it was designed that way, especially in Texas.
And see, that's the frustration that we want to begin to address here at Fronteras, Changing America. Another interesting roundtable. I want to thank Vincent Perez from Washington, D.C. and Congressman Reyes' office. We'll look forward to seeing you here in El Paso. Vince, hopefully we can have the congressman join us on our show. Gabriel, as always, it is always great to have you on our show as a regular commentator. You can catch Gabriel on elpasoforamerica.com, and you can always catch Fronteras here every evening on Thursdays at 9 p.m. We appreciate you taking a chance to have a conversation with all of us. And until next time, let's continue to think big about our future.